I recognise there are significant features in mitigation in this case, but I regret a custodial sentence is the only appropriate one given the gravity of the offence. He jailed him for 13 and a half months. Keating showed no reaction in the dock before he was led away.
How does a promising young footballer, a man once celebrated on the pitch of Celtic Park, end up behind the cold bars of a prison cell for laundering nearly €500,000 in criminal cash? Boxes stacked high with dirty money, a hidden handover that raised more questions than answers, and a career that collapsed not under the weight of injuries, but under the weight of suspicion. Who gave him the money? Was he a pawn, dragged into something much bigger? Or was he a willing player in a dangerous game that blurred the lines between sport and crime? And why did law enforcement move so quickly, as if they knew exactly where to look? Over the next 3 hours, we'll take you deep inside the €450,000 handover, the investigation that brought down an ex-Celtic striker, and the haunting reality of what happens when football and criminal cash collide. Stay tuned, and if you're watching this live premiere, drop your city in the comments below. Where are you watching from? He was once a name whispered with hope in Scottish football circles, a striker whose early promise at Celtic marked him as one to watch. Yet the road from youth stardom to lasting success was far from smooth. James Keatings had moments of brilliance, flashes of skill that carried him across clubs like Hearts, Hibernian, Hamilton, and Dundee United. But those sparks never grew into the steady flame fans had expected. Injuries clipped his wings, contract shifts eroded his confidence, and by the time his boots carried him into smaller stadiums, the bright future had dimmed into a fragile struggle for identity beyond the roar of the terraces. Scotland has always treated football as more than a sport. It is a heartbeat, a unifying faith that threads through working-class streets and polished arenas alike. But that same passion has a shadow, for the adulation is fleeting and the security it brings is often paper-thin, leaving many players vulnerable once the spotlight fades. To some, the game provides riches, while to others it leaves an empty bank account and a gnawing sense of irrelevance once the chants stop echoing. In the aftermath of a career that never fully blossomed, Keatings faced the quiet void that so many professionals dread, the transition from being recognized on the pitch to walking anonymously through everyday life. Financial uncertainty hung like a constant fog, for fame had never translated into fortune, and every missed chance carried a cost. In those moments, where identity slips and desperation sharpens, doors to darker opportunities often creak open. Behind this personal struggle lies a harsher truth about Scotland's underworld. Crime groups thrive on exploiting weaknesses in those who appear respectable on the surface. Ex-players, with their credibility intact and their finances in tatters, become attractive tools, clean faces that can move dirty money without immediate suspicion. It is a collision of two worlds, one fed by the cheers of stadiums and the other by whispers in dimly lit rooms. Law enforcement, however, had already fixed their gaze on this underworld, weaving surveillance into the fabric of daily life where illicit cash moved like unseen currents. The National Crime Agency, working closely with Police Scotland, had their suspicions trained on a network of handovers designed to funnel vast sums into circulation. It was within this invisible war against criminal cash that James Keatings's path crossed a line he could never step back from. What makes his story chilling is not simply the crime itself, but how ordinary the beginning looked. No grand scheme, no violent act, just a man once celebrated for goals, suddenly standing in the middle of an operation that would define him forever. The streets of Glasgow, quiet and cold, became the backdrop for a transaction that turned an ex-footballer into a cautionary tale. From the outside, it looked like another day in a city familiar with contrasts. But beneath the surface, history was shifting for one man who had already lost too much. Money laundering is often described in clinical terms, but at its core, it is the art of giving dirty money a clean face. Criminal organizations take funds earned through illegal means and feed them into the system in stages. Placement where the money first enters circulation, layering where it is moved, divided, and disguised, and integration where it returns as if it were legitimate wealth. Each step requires trust, precision, and someone willing to stand in the middle of a storm, presenting an appearance of normality while handling cash that is anything but normal. In this case, nearly €500,000 stood at the center of that storm, packaged in boxes that looked ordinary but carried the weight of dangerous networks. To law enforcement, those boxes were not just paper and ink. They were proof of a machine working silently beneath society's surface. The trail began with movement that was subtle, designed not to draw attention. Yet the sheer size of the money made it impossible to ignore once it crossed the wrong line of surveillance. Detectives pieced together how the cash was arranged, carried, and concealed, noting that such an amount rarely travels without purpose. When they lifted the lids and peeled back the ordinary tape, they found fingerprints that should never have been there. Among them was one belonging to a man who, only years earlier, had been known for scoring goals in front of thousands of fans. The contradiction between his past life and this present reality created an unsettling question that investigators could not shake. Was he complicit, or had he stumbled into a role scripted by others? As the National Crime Agency sharpened its focus, the operation grew into a layered investigation that spanned weeks of observation. Surveillance teams followed shadows, tracked vehicles, and mapped the paths of those moving suspicious sums, careful to avoid tipping their hand too soon. They noted handovers in quiet car parks, back streets, and dimly lit corners where boxes exchanged hands without words. Behind every exchange lay the possibility of violence, betrayal, or escape, and yet the rhythm of these meetings carried on as though routine. The name that surfaced in their reports, James Keatings, was not the one they had expected to find. But once it appeared, it could not be ignored. The handover that brought him under the brightest spotlight was deceptively simple. A transaction that lasted minutes, yet altered the course of his life forever. Observers watched as cash changed possession in a setting as ordinary as any other day in Scotland, except this day had been marked for intervention. Cameras clicked, officers held their positions, and in the silence of those moments, evidence was captured that spoke louder than words. When the boxes were seized, their weight was more than physical. It was symbolic of a hidden economy that thrived in plain sight. For investigators, it was confirmation that what they had suspected was no longer a shadow, but a reality exposed in the light. Yet beyond the facts and figures, the deeper question remained. Why him? Was it money he desperately needed after the decline of his playing career, or had he been pressured into carrying out a role he did not fully understand? Theories collided as journalists, criminologists, and fans searched for an explanation that fit the man they thought they knew. Some believed he had been seduced by quick cash. Others whispered about the long arm of organized crime reaching into vulnerable lives, and still others saw him as a pawn, a respectable face fronting something far darker. Whatever the truth, the contrast between the headlines once written about his goals and the ones now describing his guilt painted a picture that was both tragic and damning. The courtroom at Falkirk Sheriff Court carried a silence heavy enough to be felt, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. This was not a football stadium filled with chance, but the tension here was no less intense, as every eye settled on the man in the dock. James Keatings, once a striker whose name echoed in commentary boxes, now stood accused of handling cash tied to criminal operations. There was no roar of approval here, only the low murmur of curiosity and disappointment, as fans, journalists, and strangers alike tried to reconcile the man before them with the memories they once held. When the charges were read, the words seemed to cut deeper than any missed goal or lost match, stripping away the last shield of denial. The accusation was clear: possession and transfer of criminal property, a phrase clinical in tone but devastating in meaning. For Keatings, there was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide, only the stark choice between denial and admission. When he finally entered a guilty plea, the air in the room seemed to shift, a collective exhale mixed with disbelief and inevitability. It was the kind of moment that leaves people frozen, torn between sympathy and condemnation, between the past they admired and the present they could no longer ignore. His admission did not come with theatrics or excuses. It came with a quiet acceptance, almost as though he knew fighting would only prolong the pain. Lawyers offered context, explanations about a career in decline, pressures off the pitch, and a man whose vulnerabilities had been exploited. Yet the plea itself carried more weight than any speech, because it stripped away the possibility of innocence, leaving only the question of motive. The courtroom language painted a haunting picture, describing him not as a danger with weapons, but as a man carrying boxes of cash that belonged to others, boxes that were never his to touch. The contrast between the boy who once carried hopes of a nation and the man now admitting guilt was as stark as light against shadow. Reactions outside the courtroom were swift and emotional, stretching across Scotland and beyond. Some fans mourned the loss of a player they had once believed in, writing messages of sadness rather than anger, as though his downfall was a shared wound. Others expressed fury, unwilling to see vulnerability as an excuse, pointing instead to the gravity of handling nearly €500,000 in criminal funds. For the community that had watched his journey, it was a betrayal that felt deeply personal, because the fall of a public figure always reflects something about those who supported him. The press framed it as a cautionary tale, headlines screaming about another athlete undone by temptation, another life overshadowed by crime. Behind those words, however, was the quieter reality of friends, family, and former teammates processing the shock. Some remained loyal, insisting he was not defined by one mistake, while others turned away, unwilling to see him as anything but guilty. Every reaction, whether tender or harsh, only amplified the divide between who he had been and who he had become. When sentencing was finally delivered, it landed with the finality of a whistle ending a match, though this game had far greater stakes. 13 months in prison was the number chosen by the court, a year that might appear small to some but loomed like a lifetime for a man once accustomed to freedom. The guidelines left little room for leniency, for money laundering on this scale demanded consequences, no matter the background of the accused. Judges weighed his history, his career, and his choices, but ultimately determined that public trust required accountability. The message was clear. Status and fame would not shield anyone from the law when criminal cash was involved. For Keatings, the words marked the end of speculation and the beginning of punishment, a journey from headlines to handcuffs that could not be undone. And as the gavel fell, it was not just the law that judged him, but the entire world watching. Even in that moment of clarity, questions remained unresolved, lingering like shadows in the corridors of justice. Whose money had it truly been? Who orchestrated the handovers that placed him in the crosshairs of investigators? Was he acting on his own, driven by desperation, or was he caught in the grip of something far larger and more dangerous than anyone dared to admit? Investigators had their suspicions, but suspicions are not always convictions, and the silence of criminal networks leaves gaps no courtroom can easily fill. For the public, the absence of full answers only deepened the intrigue, making his case both closed and open at the same time. It is in these gaps that conspiracy thrives, where theories spread, and where the line between fact and speculation blurs. And so, even as his sentence was sealed, the bigger mystery of the €450,000 handover remained unfinished, hanging like a shadow over his conviction. Prison is a place where identity is stripped down to numbers and routines, and for a man who once wore jerseys with pride, the transition was brutal. The echoes of cheering crowds were replaced with the clang of metal doors and the constant shuffle of footsteps in narrow corridors. Inmates knew who he was, some offering respect for his past, others using his notoriety as a weapon to remind him that fame held no currency here. The solitude of a cell leaves room for reflection, but it also sharpens the sting of regret, forcing him to confront choices that could not be undone. Days blurred into nights, marked not by goals scored but by time served, and the rhythm of survival became his only focus. Behind those walls, the silence was heavy, filled with unasked questions about what might have been if a different decision had been made. Each sunrise brought him closer to release, yet each sunset reminded him of the cost already paid. His probable release after 13 months offered a timeline, but it also painted a picture of a man who would step out into a world that no longer saw him the same way. A return to football seemed almost impossible, not because of ability but because of trust that had been broken. Clubs, once eager for his presence, now carried hesitation, wary of the headlines his name would bring. Reputation in sports is fragile, and for Keatings, it fractured beyond repair the moment cash and crime collided. The career he had fought to salvage was gone, replaced with whispers and questions that followed his name into every conversation. Even those who once defended him could not deny the permanent mark left by his conviction. The reality was harsh. Freedom would come, but redemption would not be handed out as easily. The broader implications stretched beyond his own life, casting a harsh light on the vulnerability of athletes once their careers end. Football, celebrated for the joy it brings, rarely prepares its players for the void that follows retirement or decline. Without proper support, many find themselves adrift, searching for purpose and stability in places that are neither safe nor legal. Organized crime sees this weakness and exploits it, offering money that fills pockets quickly but empties futures permanently. Keatings's fall became another chapter in a troubling pattern, where the fame of yesterday turns into the downfall of today. It raised the uncomfortable question of whether the game itself bears some responsibility for failing those who once carried it. For fans watching from the outside, it became a reminder that the line between glory and ruin can be terrifyingly thin. Stories like his are not isolated, for other athletes across the world have found themselves entangled in schemes they never imagined when their careers began. Some turned to gambling, others to fraud, and a few, like Keatings, to laundering money for networks far more powerful than they could resist. Each case serves as both a warning and a tragedy, because they expose the cracks in systems that celebrate young men but fail to protect them once their usefulness fades. Criminal cash does not discriminate. It attaches itself to opportunity, whether that opportunity is a struggling ex-footballer or a businessman in crisis. What makes his case haunting is the ordinariness of it. No dramatic heist, no armed confrontation, just boxes of money that seemed simple until their weight crushed everything he had left. The absence of violence did not make the consequences lighter. It made them all the more sobering. For the public, it was proof that crime is not always loud. It can be quiet, calculated, and devastating. As coverage of his sentence faded from headlines, what remained were the images of him scoring goals in his prime, now replayed alongside courtroom sketches and prison reports. The duality of those memories created a strange dissonance for fans, who struggled to reconcile the athlete they once cheered with the convict now serving time. Football highlights carried nostalgia, but they also carried sadness, as though each replay was a reminder of what was lost. The idea that a man once so full of promise could be undone by one decision made the tragedy feel even heavier. For some, those memories kept him human, preventing his story from being reduced to a headline. For others, they only sharpened the pain, because they could not forgive what he had done with the trust he was given. In either case, the legacy of James Keatings was no longer defined solely by sport but by a crime that would forever shadow his name. In the end, his story was not just about money or the law, it was about the fragility of choices and the weight of consequences. It asked questions about desperation, about temptation, and about the systems that fail people when they need guidance most. For Keatings, prison became the physical consequence, but the emotional consequence was far deeper, stretching into every part of his life that had once held meaning. Those who knew him personally saw not just a footballer, but a man brought down by circumstances and decisions that spiraled beyond his control. Society, however, tends to remember outcomes more than causes, and his outcome was now sealed. The wider lesson lingered like a warning to others who might face similar crossroads. In football, mistakes may cost a game, but in life, mistakes can cost freedom itself. This story is not simply about one man's fall from grace, but about the fragile line between triumph and ruin, a line that can shift with one decision. The jersey that once carried pride became a memory, while the prison number became a reality, showing how quickly life can turn when vulnerability meets temptation. It forces us to look beyond the surface and ask how easily success can be undone when there is no safety net beneath it. We are left with questions that linger in silence. Do you believe justice was served in this case? Or was the sentence too light for the crime? Was James Keatings a mastermind in control of every step? Or was he a pawn caught in the machinery of something larger than himself? And more importantly, should football do more to protect players when the final whistle blows on their careers, so they do not find themselves in the grip of shadows like these? If you stayed with us through this journey, make sure you leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters as much as the story itself. Like this video if it kept you thinking, and share it with others who care about the hidden costs of crime behind the headlines. Subscribe for more deep-dive true crime documentaries, and remember, the discussion doesn't end here. It begins with you.